One morning, a lawyer called me with news that changed everything. My stepfather had left me his house on Clover Mill Road. I was standing in the office break room, eating a granola bar over the sink because I had forgotten to bring lunch. I stared at the wrapper while the lawyer spoke. I did not cry. I did not speak for a long time. All I could think about was the kitchen window in that house, the one with the broken latch that my stepfather never fixed, even though he kept a notepad on the fridge just for things like that. He had been gone for 11 days, but before I tell you what happened after that call, I need to take you back to when I was 12. That is really where this story starts. My mother got married again when I was 9. His name was Frank. He was quiet, a little awkward at social gatherings, the kind of man who kept his library card right behind his driver's license and actually used it. He worked as a civil engineer for the county and drove a beige car that he washed himself every other weekend. He was not exciting. He was nothing like a movie stepfather. He never showed up at my school play with flowers. He never coached my sports team or took me on a trip to bond with me. Instead, he did smaller, quieter things. He learned which cereal I liked. He turned the TV down when I was doing homework without me having to ask. One night when I was around 10, I had a nightmare and wandered out to the living room at 2 a.m. He was already awake on the couch. He simply moved over and handed me the other end of the blanket without making a big deal out of it. My mother, on the other hand, was someone who always seemed slightly behind schedule. She loved me, I believe, in whatever way she was able to. But loving a child and raising one well are two very different things, and she had only truly learned one of them. She got bored easily. She was always drawn to whatever was new. Frank had been new once. By the time I was 12, she had found something else. I will not give his name any space here. What mattered was that she started coming home late, then later, then sometimes not at all. Frank never said a single bad word about her to me, not once. I have thought about that a lot over the years. He could have. It would have been so easy, but he chose not to. He just kept making dinner. He kept signing my school forms. He drove me to school on rainy mornings without me ever having to ask. When my mother finally left, which she did on a Tuesday in October with 2 bags and a look on her face like she had already moved on, Frank sat me down at the kitchen table and told me the truth as gently as I have ever heard anyone do it. He said that adults sometimes make choices that hurt people they love, and that her leaving had nothing to do with me. Then he said he was going to stay. He said it the way someone says a fact, not to comfort you, but because it is simply true. He stayed. He adopted me legally when I was 14. I remember a judge in a small wood-paneled room that smelled like old paper asking me if this was what I wanted. I said yes. I meant it more than I had ever meant anything in my life. After that, we were not a dramatic family. We had dinner together most nights. We watched nature shows on Sunday evenings. He taught me to drive in an empty shopping center parking lot. When I graduated high school, he shook my hand and then, after a pause, pulled me into a hug that lasted about 4 seconds longer than either of us planned. We both pretended not to notice. I moved 3 hours away for college and then settled in the city. We talked every Sunday morning. He texted in complete sentences with proper punctuation and sometimes used the word indeed. He visited once a year, always in April, and he always brought the same brand of coffee because he had noticed years ago that it was the one I kept at home. He never forgot details like that. He was told he had a heart condition when I was 27. He mentioned it on the phone the same way he would mention roadwork on the highway. Just facts. Here is what we are dealing with. Here is the plan. He had a good doctor. He was changing what he ate. He had started taking morning walks. He was fine for 3 years. He actually was fine. And then one Thursday in February, he was not. He died at home, which was how he had wanted it. A neighbor found him. I drove those 3 hours in just under 2.5, and I stayed in the house on Clover Mill Road for a week and took care of everything that needed to be taken care of. I held myself together until I found that notepad on the refrigerator. The broken window latch was still written there, so was a leaky bathroom faucet, and at the very bottom, in smaller handwriting than the rest, was my name with a question mark beside it. Just my name. A question mark. I've never been able to figure out exactly what he meant by that, and I think I will spend the rest of my life being quietly grateful that he wrote it. His affairs were in order. He had a will, and he had kept it current. He left me the house on Clover Mill Road and most of his savings, which together came to just over $1.9 million, including the property. There were smaller amounts set aside for a few charities he believed in and for a former coworker who had helped him through something he never fully explained to me. But the bulk of everything came to me. I had not expected it. I knew about the house. I did not know about the savings. He had lived quietly and spent carefully his whole life, and I simply had not thought about what that would add up to over time. I found out on a Tuesday, 11 days after he died, standing in a break room eating a granola bar. I cried in my car for about 20 minutes and then drove back to my desk and got through the rest of the afternoon, because that is what he would have done. The timeline matters here, so I want to be clear about it. The will went through probate court in March. It was a clean document, properly witnessed and notarized, with no gray areas. The attorney, a careful man named Mr. Ashford, who had handled Frank's legal matters for more than a decade, told me the process would take several months but was unlikely to be complicated. He used the word unlikely. 6 weeks after the funeral, in April, I received a certified letter at my apartment mailbox. My mother was contesting the will. I read it twice standing outside in the parking lot. Then I went inside and made tea that I did not drink and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Her claim was undue influence. As I came to understand it, the legal argument was that I had somehow manipulated Frank, a man with an engineering degree and 40 years of careful record-keeping, into leaving me everything, that I had, in the words of the letter, used a position of trust to unfairly benefit myself. Her lawyer was named Mr. Guthrie, and based on the tone of the filing, he was the kind of attorney who charged extra for aggressive sentences. I called Mr. Ashford. He was calm. He said this kind of challenge happens sometimes with estates of this size. He said we had a strong case. He also said that Frank had left a personal letter with the will explaining his own reasoning, something Frank had thought to do and that Mr. Ashford had gently encouraged. He told me to let him handle it. I did. For 2 months, I watched documents move back and forth. I answered Mr. Ashford's questions. I gathered records, birthday cards, phone logs, proof of a relationship that needed no proof to me, but apparently needed to be shown to a court. I found a box in a closet holding 23 years of things Frank had kept. My school photos, a drawing I had made at age 10 that I had completely forgotten about, a crooked house with a crooked tree and 2 stick figures in the yard. He had kept it in a folder with my name on it. In June, there was a mediation session that went nowhere. My mother sat across a conference table from me for the first time in over 8 years. She looked older, which I had expected. She did not look sorry, which I had also expected, though it still settled somewhere uncomfortable in my chest. Her attorney made arguments that seemed designed more to unsettle me than to actually work legally. He claimed that Frank, in his later years, had become too dependent on my calls and visits, which he said showed diminished thinking. He suggested my relationship with Frank had been deliberately built for personal gain. He used the word strategically 4 times in 1 hour. I said very little. Mr. Ashford had told me to say very little. Walking to my car afterward, I thought about the notepad on the refrigerator. I thought about Sunday morning calls. I thought about April visits and the wrong brand of coffee and a hug that lasted 4 seconds longer than expected. I was not afraid of losing. I was afraid of how ugly things would get before we won. The hearing was set for late September. 1 week before it, Mr. Ashford called to tell me something he had found in Frank's files. Over a period of 8 years, Frank had written what he called letters of record, not addressed to anyone in particular, just placed into a folder in his office filing cabinet, labeled with the year. They were not dramatic. They were careful, specific, and dated. They recorded small things, the Sunday calls, the April visits, the time I drove 3 hours through a snowstorm for a minor procedure because he had said he was fine, and I had known he was only partly fine. He described our relationship as, in his own words, the one I am most proud of in my adult life. He had kept these letters because he was an engineer. He documented things. It was simply who he was. Mr. Ashford said, in his measured way, that these letters were going to make things much simpler. That night, I sat in my apartment thinking about Frank at his desk on quiet evenings, writing those letters. Not because he thought anyone would ever read them, just because it felt right to him to say the true thing clearly and keep a record of it. That was exactly who he was. The hearing lasted less than 3 hours. My mother's attorney made his arguments. Mr. Ashford presented Frank's letters. He presented 23 years of evidence that had been sitting quietly in a box in a closet. He presented a man's life as it had actually been lived. The judge, a composed woman who had clearly read every document carefully, asked my mother's attorney a series of questions he did not answer well. At one point, she looked up from the letters and said in a tone that was not unkind, but left very little room for argument, that she was having difficulty finding any legal basis for the influence claim given what the record showed. Mr. Guthrie said some things. They did not amount to much. The judge ruled in my favor. The will stood. I walked out of that courthouse into a September afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment before going anywhere. The trees on the street had just started to change color. A woman was walking her dog. Ordinary life was happening in every direction. I called Mr. Ashford from the parking lot and thanked him. He said it had always been a clean case and that Frank had made it easy simply by being Frank. That evening, I drove to the house on Clover Mill Road. I had not been back since February. I let myself in, turned on the kitchen light, and stood there for a while. The broken window latch was still broken. The notepad was still on the fridge. My name was still at the bottom with the question mark beside it. I fixed the latch. It took about 4 minutes. Frank kept his tools organized in the garage, which I should have known, so it was easy to find what I needed. I still have the house. A young family rents it now, a couple about my age, 2 kids, and a dog that is apparently terrified of the kitchen floor for reasons nobody has been able to explain. They sent me a Christmas card last year. The kids had drawn on the envelope. The savings I have used carefully. Some went toward things Frank would have approved of, practical things, long-term things. A portion went to setting up a small scholarship fund at the community college in his county for students studying engineering or technical fields. It is not a large fund. It carries his name. A few students have used it. I once received an email from one of them, a 20-year-old who was the first in her family to attend college. She had written it carefully, formally, the way you write something when you are not quite sure of yourself but want to get it right. She said receiving the scholarship had made her feel like someone was paying attention. Frank paid attention. That was the whole thing about him, really. In a world full of people who do not, Frank paid attention. I still do Sunday calls now, just to the people in my own life. I have gotten better at staying in touch. I have gotten better at saying things clearly instead of assuming the other person already knows. There is a notepad on my refrigerator. I keep it for things I mean to fix. I am working through the list. I have thought a lot about what it actually means when someone stays. Not in any grand or romantic sense, just when everyone else has somewhere else to be. When leaving is easy and staying is inconvenient. When nothing is requiring a person to remain, and they remain anyway, quietly, without announcing it, without keeping score. Frank stayed. That is the whole of it, and everything that followed. The house, the letters in the filing cabinet, the hearing that lasted less than 3 hours, the scholarship that now carries his name. All of it came from that one fact. He stayed. I think about my mother sometimes, not with bitterness the way I used to, but with something closer to clarity. She made choices. Those choices had weight. Not because life kept a scorecard and eventually handed down a verdict, but because choices shape a person over time, and the person you become is the life you end up living. She became someone who left, and then years later she became someone who came back only when there was money involved. That is not a punishment. That is just the result of who she chose to be, building up slowly across decades. Frank became someone who noticed which cereal I liked, who turned down the TV without being asked, who in the last years of his life sat quietly at his desk and wrote things down, not because anyone would read them, but because it felt right to him to say the true thing and keep a record of it. That is not a reward either. That is just what you build yourself into through small, careful choices made one at a time. There is something worth sitting with in that. The idea that character is not something you either have or do not have. It is something you practice in small moments when no one is watching and nothing important is at stake. Frank practiced it every week when he volunteered to drive elderly neighbors to their appointments. He practiced it the night he sat beside a 10-year-old having a nightmare and handed her the other end of a blanket without making it into a moment. He practiced it for 23 years. And when it mattered, the record was there, not because he had planned it that way, but because it was simply the accumulation of who he was. I think about that young woman who emailed me about the scholarship, first in her family to go to college, writing carefully, trying to get the words right. She said it made her feel like someone was paying attention. That is all any of us really need. Someone who notices, someone who writes your name at the bottom of a notepad with a question mark because they are still thinking about you, still wondering how you are doing, still keeping you somewhere in their thoughts, even on the most ordinary evenings. I fixed the window latch. It took 4 minutes. I've been working through the list since then, slowly, imperfectly, in a way that Frank himself would have recognized. Not because finishing the list means something special, but because it feels right to try. Because someone showed me, without ever saying it out loud, that the small things are not actually small, that showing up matters, that staying is a choice you make again and again, and that over time it adds up to something no court can ever take away from you. I keep a notepad on my refrigerator. I am working through the list.